As Steve mentioned, I am a curator. I work in Edinburgh at the National Museum of Scotland. But how did I get into carrion beetles? I'm often asked this. So I actually thought I wanted to be a forensic scientist. So my first degree was in forensic science. I'd watched a lot of CSI, but also a very good friend of the family is a fingerprint expert. So she took me into work at Surrey Police Headquarters one day, and I just thought, this is amazing. Got all my sciences at college and went off to the University of Derby to go and do forensic science. But actually it was in end of my first year that I had a lecture on forensic entomology from Professor Carri-on, and that just really turned my head. I had no idea that insects could have this application in solving crimes. And so I specialised, and I did all my third year research on a bunch of dead rabbits, several dead rabbits, and I was actually interested in looking how wrapping a body, how methods of concealment would affect the insect succession. I hope none of you are eating. I know, Ian, you said you were eating at some point, so apologies for that. I do have a couple of pictures of decomposing animals. No humans will feature in this talk, and I think there's a little bit of decomposition in here. So yeah, I did this research project in forensic entomology, but I was persuaded to broaden my horizons. So following getting a first in that degree, I went on to entomology and I did that at Harper Adams. And then I was applying for jobs, and one came up at the University of Edinburgh. And I worked there for a year, and I was basically responsible for breeding huge numbers of burying beetles to be used in experiments, and then designing and implementing these experiments because of their fascinating behaviour that they have. So I'm going to talk you through this if you're not familiar with it shortly. But in between this job and graduating from my master's, I volunteered at the Natural History Museum, and that's where I became obsessed with collections. So I think working at the university was a fantastic experience for me, but we were just working with one species, and this just wasn't enough. I'd seen the diversity of insects and I really wanted to do more. So that's how I ended up at MS. I started volunteering whilst I was doing that job at the university, made a nuisance of myself, was very keen and eager, and I was just in the right place at the right time, and a job came up and they took me on. So 6 years later, I'm still there, and I help manage a collection of 2.5 million insect specimens, and it is a brilliant job. A little bit different in current times, but yeah, I'm very privileged to be doing what I'm doing, and I'm able to incorporate my love of carrion beetles into my work, which has been fantastic. I've been able to develop this specialism, and this has led me to visit other collections throughout the UK and also internationally, which has been very exciting. So I have met 2 of the world authorities on carrion beetles. This is Jan Rajitska here in the blue t-shirt, and Derek Sykes from North America, and of course Max Barkley from the NHM, who is now a good friend of mine, and he is part of the reason I also study sylphids, because my first visit behind the scenes at the NHM, he showed me the sylphid collection and we properly nerded out about that. So that's a little bit about an explanation of how I am where I am. Sylphids, I am incredibly biased. I think they're the best beetle group. They're very small. So in the UK, we just have 21 species recorded from here, but globally there's about 200 species. And for such a small family, they are pretty diverse. Of course, most of them are associated with carrion, but you've got all sorts of other weird and wonderful behaviours in there too. You've got some that have evolved to be brood parasites, some that have actually switched their host preferences from vertebrate remains to being parasitoids of snake eggs. Really, really weird and wonderful things that are happening here. You've got predatory species in the group, and then you've got some absolutely dazzling Asian species too, which are iridescent colours. So I think they're just a fantastic group. And of course, they serve this really important ecological niche. They are part of nature's decomposers. So they are really vital in recycling all that nutrients and removing waste matter. As Erica McAllister likes to say, if we didn't have the flies and the carrion beetles, we would be wading through bodies. So we have a lot to be grateful for to them. And because I love this group so much, I just have a small amount of my work time where I'm allowed to specialise. So in my spare time, I help co-organise the National Still Footy Recording Scheme, which you may have heard of. We did run a workshop for the Tiniptera project a couple of years ago. So that was at the World Museum, and that was brilliant. In the past, we've hosted lots of physical workshops. Now we've been doing some virtually. We actually I have another one that I'm doing for COFNOD on the 27th of this month, if anyone's interested in learning more about these beetles in more detail. But the recording scheme is very much a team effort. It's myself, Matt Esch, who was doing his master's research on carrion beetles when I met him, and Richard Wright, who you might be familiar with. He's another coleopterist involved with producing beetle news, and he'd already sort of launched a recording scheme for this group back in, I think it was 2010 or so, but that had really just involved writing a key that was freely accessible, and it's only when Matt and I came along in 2016 that we tried to make it more, make it a bigger thing, try to encourage general public, get people interested that weren't doing any other type of beetle recording. So we've really been trying to raise awareness of these beetles and get people to submit their sightings via iRecord, and then we're both verifiers on there. So really just been trying to create this big pool of data so that we could learn more about their distributions and how they're changing over time, and ultimately how we can conserve some of their populations. So as mentioned, we've got 21 species recorded from the UK, and I have knocked out a couple of species that are not relevant to your area for this talk today, to keep things nice and simple. So we'll go over a little bit of the behaviour and ecology, and also some of the key identification features, and see if I can try and persuade some of you that maybe aren't recording these beetles yet to do so. I have some favourites. I'll try not to be too biased though. So we'll start with the Necrophorous. Now, these are the true carrion feeders, and they have a couple of common names. Burying beetles, which I prefer. It is very descriptive of what they do, their incredible behaviour. But another one you might be familiar with is sexton beetles, and this links in with their association with death and particularly graveyards, so they get that nickname. But burying beetles is the common name assigned to them because of their behaviour of burying their carcasses that they encounter. And they bury their resource because the competition is so high. So carrion is an incredibly ephemeral resource. They've only got a short window in which to locate it and secure it and use it. You've obviously got lots of other animals that are interested in carrion, such as blowflies, flesh flies, houseflies, and then other scavengers that are vertebrates, such as foxes and badgers, not to mention other groups of beetles. So it's fierce competition. So they're burying it to kind of conceal it and keep this resource for themselves. So it's through this pressure that they have evolved this behaviour. And the behaviour is that they display biparental care, which is very unusual, as we know, within non-social insects, that they will invest this amount of care, but both male and female will prepare the resource and care for the young. And they do this by, sorry again, if you're just having a snack there, but they do this by stripping the fur or feathers of a small vertebrate carcass that they locate, such as a dead mouse or dead bird. And then they excavate soil from underneath the corpse. Slowly this carcass sinks down into the soil, and then they cover it over. They tend to prepare the carcass in a very particular way, where once they have stripped it of the fur or feathers, they will mold it into a nest shape. So they use their mandibles to break up the flesh, and they also have secretions that they coat the carcass in. It looks a little bit slimy here, but these secretions are very, very impressive. Not only do they have antimicrobial properties, so they help compete against the microbial succession that's happening on the corpse as well. They actually slow down the rate of decomposition so that this food source lasts longer. But some brand new research has actually shown that these secretions that they coat it in actually repel the competitors as well, help make the carcass less attractive. This is really impressive. So they've prepared it, they've kind of molded it into this shape to the carcass or in the soil just below. And when those eggs hatch into the first instar larvae, they come to the top of the carcass where the parents have made a crater, and they rest in there, and the parents will feed on the flesh and regurgitate to the offspring, which is a lovely, charming family setup. At the same time, you've got the kind of defense of the carcass too. So it's quite often the male will take on the role of patrolling around the carcass, even though they're buried. There may still be other invertebrates that come down to their home, so he'll be on patrol. You'll also sometimes get rival burying beetles that will dig down and try to invade, potentially kill the dominant male, or females that will take over the brood. So a lot of dramatics that happen, and it's very much like a soap opera, which is why I find these beetles so fascinating. So you've got a lovely action shot here of a female Necrophorous Vespeloides tending to the young there, and some more feeding action. So that it gets even more impressive that there is begging that happens within this nest-like setup. So they are very much like birds in this behavior. The larvae aren't able to vocalize, but they do tactile begging. So they will rear up and touch the parents on the face with their legs. And this is a request for more resources. Some researchers found that unfortunately, it's a thin line to tread as a burying beetle larva. And if you beg too much, the parents will cull those offspring. So these beetles are being studied quite heavily in order to find out these interesting behaviours. But what usually happens is that the parents, the female in particular, will lay the correct number of eggs depending on the size of the resource. So this doesn't happen all that often. Now, I mentioned that the larvae can't vocalise, but the adults do stridulate. You've probably heard this if you've disturbed them out in the field, and it is very squeaky. One of the earlier documentations of this noise was described it as almost being like a bumblebee. I think it's a little bit different, but I have got a clip to play to you. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it if you haven't experienced this before. But the way that they stridulate is that they have this stridulatory file. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, as they have these two bands here, this ridge, and they have some hairs on the tip and underside of the elytra. So what they do is when the wing cases are closed, they move their abdomen in and out, and it rubs past these hairs on the file here, creating this squeaky noise. So let's see if this will play ball for us today. So very squeaky. But actually, it was only when doing further research for the book that I realised there are actually 3 documented types of stridulation. So I don't speak burying beetle yet. I'm not able to interpret these myself, but the one that we're hearing here is most likely to be defensive. So they have 3 types of stridulation. The first one being defensive. So obviously that's a back off, stay away, to try to ward off any predators. Second one is a courtship stridulation to obviously try to attract a mate. And then thirdly, they have a parental stridulation, because when there are 3 instars and when the offspring get to the late second or third, they are able to self-feed. So sometimes the offspring will be moving around, they won't be right near the parents, but if the parents have decided it's time to feed, then they kind of signal to the offspring to come back to the crater. So those 3 types of stridulation. And then if you find these beetles, you'll quite often notice that there are some hitchhikers. So beetles with Carrion. And I'm afraid I don't identify these mites as species myself, but they are well known, and they are generally believed to have a symbiotic relationship with the beetles. I say generally, because it's not, again, very clear cut. So generally what happens is these mites will hitch a lift on the beetle because they are also looking to go to carrion. So the beetles will give these mites a lift. They then will exit the beetle when they arrive at carrion, and they generally are feeding on the fly eggs and larvae that are present. So this is helping to eradicate the competition from that the beetles face, but it has been documented that the mites will also predate on beetle eggs too. So there's a little bit more research that needs to be done into these, but generally, if you see a carrion beetle that's completely overloaded with mites, this is quite normal, and don't worry too much. So recognizing a carrion beetle, I'm sure I'm pretty much preaching to the choir here. I know some of you are coleopterists and you'll be very familiar with how to recognize one. If you're not, you tend to either recognize a bearing beetle or one of the other ones. This is a typical bearing beetle that I'm showing at the moment, but we'll look at some pictures of the other subfamily shortly. They have really distinct clubbed antennae. And they have truncated elytra so that some of their abdominal segments are showing. Their tarsal formation is 5-5-5, so they each have 5 segments there on each of the tarsi. And they're generally dark in colour, and several of the species have this banding of bright orangey red. We have got free ID resources available on our recording scheme page. But as I mentioned, we've also got a brand new shiny book. So there is identification keys in here as well. So as I mentioned, it's not just an atlas. One of the main features actually is that there's a brand new key to hysterids in here. And of course, we've also included a key to sylphids, which is slightly different from the one that we used from the recording scheme. There are a few changes that I wanted to make myself, so those are in there. But the keys, I'll just show you one of the hysterid ones now, feature images alongside the couplets, which we thought was really important rather than having them on separate pages and going to and fro in the book. So there are identification keys in there. There's also identification keys in Duff, and there is still some available via Beetle News as well, which were Richard's original versions. I mentioned that you either recognise a burying beetle or one of the other ones. So this is because the family Sylphidae is split into 2 subfamilies. So you have the Necrophorines with the clubbed antennae, and you have the Sulfini that aren't clubbed. They do gradually expand towards the tip, but you don't have that same distinct solid club. So that's splitting those. And then of the burying beetles, you can see we have these 6 species. In the book, we do include 7, but one of them, Necrophorous germanicus, we do not believe to have been native and resident at present. So we have one that's all black and is Necrophorous humator, super easy to recognise that one. Second easiest to eliminate is the most common species, which is Necrophorous Vespeloides, and this has completely black antennal clubs, whereas these other 4 all have orange on their clubs. And then what you need to be looking at to identify the rest of these is the presence of hairs on the pronotum, and the type of orange banding that we have, and whether or not it is continuous across the suture or if there is a gap. And then most importantly, we want to be seeing the colour of any hairs that are present on the abdomen. So I'll just take you through a couple of these common species. So we have provided some common names within the book, and I know that this causes a bit of debate sometimes, the use of common names. Primarily, we want to encourage the use of scientific names throughout, but in terms of raising awareness of this group and increasing interest amongst general public and beginners, Steve and I both thought that it was quite a good opportunity to have some fun and introduce some common names, and also correct some common names that were already in use. So the Undertaker is one that's a little bit fun, just to try and create a bit of interest there. As mentioned, it's super easy to identify. It's all black and it has orange antennal clubs. It is the one that is always active first in spring. We've already had our first records of this come through this year. It's actually incredibly early almost a month earlier than our previous earliest record for the spring. So yeah, that's one that if you're putting a light trap out, you should be getting it anytime now. Necrophorous Vespeloides, as I mentioned, is our most common bearing beetle, and this is where we did a name change for the common name, because previously Necrophorous Vespeloides was called the common burying beetle, but it is not the most common in the UK, so we have suggested a change there. This species is also day active, so if you've got a nice hot sunny day, this is one that you'll get in flight. They are good flyers. They're capable of flying a considerable distance to locate carrion, and it's the only one that's predominantly day flying. The rest are crepuscular or completely night active. Vespeloides that I mentioned, that was previously called the common burying beetle, is probably my favourite of the brightly coloured ones. It has these iconic curved hind tibia, so it has kind of this cowboy stance. So it's like the John Wayne of the carrion beetles. And it's also incredibly hairy. So it has this beautiful golden pubescence across the pronotum. And actually it's the only one that has any hairs on the elytra too. Really lovely, especially when you get a really fresh adult, really, really nice coloration. And we've got Necrophorous investigator. This is our second most common one in light traps. And I say this like I'm assuming that you all know. If we've got any moth recorders in the house, you will, I'm sure, have had experience with these beetles in your moth traps. They do come to light. So I know that this is sometimes a problem because they will munch your moths in the trap. Sorry about that. But we've been utilising this crossover with moths and beetles as a way of trying to encourage more people to record them. So we'll get to this a bit later with the trapping methods, but you are bound to see these at light traps. So this one's super common and widespread, definitely one that occurs in your area. And it's not in any identification keys, but a little feature that people have been picking up on for this species is that its second banding is reduced to 2 separate splodges that look a little bit like Scotty dogs. So if it helps you to remember this one, this one has the 2 Scotty dogs on its elytra. So that's the Necrophorines, that's the burying beetles or the sexton beetles. But the Sylphini, that contains several more species, and they're pretty diverse. So we've got some carrion feeders in here, but we've also got some predators and some vegetarians. There's a little bit less variation in their colour. They're all very dark, black with slight reddish tinges. By far the largest is Necrophorous littoralis. This is the shore sexton beetle. We didn't change this common name because it's already quite well established, but as you can tell from the name littoralis, it was previously thought that this was associated with the shore, but this is also found inland. When I did my undergrad research, as I mentioned, on putting out dead rabbits in the middle of Derbyshire, I got several specimens of this beetle. So this is one that is associated with the shore. It's another one you'll get in light traps, and is sometimes confused with the black burying beetle because of its similar size and because the key mentions that it has orange tips to its antennae. But you'll notice that these are not clubbed, they are thread-like. The strangest record that we've had of this species was actually from some of my colleagues at the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. So for the last few years, they've had one of these corpse flowers blooming, and really, really impressive plants to see. We were fortunate that we teamed up with them because because of my interest in carrion insects, we wanted to monitor to see if any of the blowflies made it into the glass house. They didn't. It wasn't very successful in terms of the flies, but actually we did get a female Necrophorous littoralis in the flower, in the big inflorescence, the day after it released its big stench. So that was a pretty interesting one, and the only record of that we have in the UK. The native homelands of this plant is Sumatra, so it is not likely to happen again here, but in the wild, this plant utilizes carrion insects rather than your typical pollinators to do the pollination of this plant. Of the Thanatophilus species, for your area, you do get two, Thanatophilus rugosus and Thanatophilus sinuatus. Thanatophilus dispar is incredibly rare and scarce. It's only known from 7 sites in Britain and Ireland at present, and its strongholds are in Scotland. We've got it in a small population around Loch Leven in Kinross, and it's also doing pretty well on the Western Isles and over in Northern Ireland. So to split Thanatophilus rugosus and sinuatus, you can probably tell there, they're quite different on their elytra. Rugosus has this lovely lumpy bumpy texture to its wing cases, hence the name rugosus, and its common name we've assigned it is the wrinkled death lover. And the sinuatus is the smooth death lover. As I mentioned, we've got some predatory species in here too. So this is again why I like this group so much, because they're such a diverse little family. So the predators are Phosphia atrata, Ablateria laevigata, and Dendroxina quadrimaculata. You can look at these two on the left and centre. They share this wonderfully narrow head. So if you're not aware of these ones already, there's a little telltale sign here that they are snail feeders. So they use these fantastic narrowheads to really gain access to their prey. They're quite similar to glowworms in the way that they tackle their prey. They will bite the foot of the mollusk then retracts into its shell, where it has nowhere to escape to, and the beetle will release digestive enzymes, and this helps breaks through the mucus that's released by the snail, but also starts to break down the flesh of the mollusk, and then uses that head to really get right in there and devour the prey. So fantastically successful predators, very widespread and common, and it comes in 2 colour forms, which you may have observed. There seems to be no rhyme or reason for these colour forms. You can quite often find the black and red ones together, and easiest time to locate them is now, or any time over winter, because they are overwintering under bark. So under any dead logs, any fallen logs, mossy blankets, they absolutely are really easy to find at this time of year. So the other hunter is a predator of caterpillars, so not a snail feeder. This one is a little more scarce. I think we've just got 1 or 2 historical records in your area, actually. So this is definitely one to be on the lookout for now. Best thing to do to try to find this one is to go and do some beating of oak trees or hawthorn bushes, where it's found feeding on the caterpillars of Lepidoptera. So it is nationally scarce, but I do think it's under-recorded. We potentially need to do some field work where we get people out on cherry pickers, checking those really good big oak trees rather than just bashing at the bottom branches. This is a vegetarian carrion beetle, so not a carrion beetle at all. A Clypea opaca, and it's known as the golden beet carrion beetle. So this is another nationally scarce one. There are a few records from your neck of the woods, and it is a veggie that feeds predominantly on beet and other members of the Amaranthaceae family. And it was previously actually considered to be a pest of beet crops, but really, I mean, it's hard to say for sure. There's no doubt that the use of pesticides on those crops has probably had an effect on these beetles, especially with regards to their current status now. But further investigation would need to be done. This is one that I see in Scotland out on the dunes, definitely has a kind of coastal distribution up here, but it is absolutely stunning. When you see a live specimen of this and you catch it in the sunlight, it is absolutely covered in these dense golden hairs. It almost looks like a kind of little teddy bear of a beetle. It's a really lovely species. Aesoptoma thoraxicum is a really interesting one because it's one that I consider to be common and very widespread. But when I was looking at records for Cheshire and Lancashire, I actually noticed we've got quite a gap in the maps. So I'd like to set a bit of a challenge to you all, if you don't mind. This spring and summer, if you could pay particular close attention to woodlands and have a look out for this species for us, that would be really, really helpful. It's one that is not too fussy. It will go for carrion, but it's also found on decomposing fungi. It's quite partial to the odd dog dung, especially if you're in woods where people like to discard their dog dung. And it's predominantly active between April and August. So yeah, search woodlands this spring and summer and let us know. I'm sure it's just under-recorded, but would be really, really interested to know. Has a particular association with the Stinkon fungus. We've got quite a few records of yeah, these fungi absolutely covered. Obviously, these are similar to the corpse flower that I mentioned. They're releasing this foul odour to try and attract the carrion insects in to move their spores around. I thought I'd also give the larvae a mention because when we set the recording scheme up, we definitely weren't prepared to do anything with larvae. As many of you know, identification of the larvae is quite difficult for most beetle groups. Sylphids, there were some partial keys existing, but there still isn't anything that covers all our British species at present. So this is something that I want to tackle further down the line. But we did find that people were submitting records saying that they thought they had some sylphid larvae. So when I give talks, I do try to give a little bit more information about them. You can distinguish the two subfamilies quite easily, as you can with the adults. Obviously, due to their life history, they are quite different. The Necrophorines, the way that they're raised, they're underground, they're protected, they've got active parents that are there to guard them, so they are not so sclerotized, they're very squishy. Whereas the sylphines, they are left to fend for themselves, so the eggs are laid on carrion above ground, and there are no parents to guard them, so they kind of have a bit more armor plating, and they're either feeding directly on carrion or they're predatory, hunting other invertebrates. So you can distinguish the two quite easily, but we're really, really interested in establishing a better collection, or at least I'm interested in establishing a better voucher collection of these. I'm growing it slowly, but really if anyone comes across any larvae, particularly the sylphines, because you'll sometimes find them in a big mass. You'll find lots of them together, and if you wouldn't mind taking a couple of voucher specimens for us, that would be absolutely fantastic, because as soon as I get some more specimens behind me, the sooner we can get a key out to help us identify and help more of you identify them to species level. Now, if I can convince you to do some trapping and monitoring of carrion beetles, then there are a few different ways that we can do this. Of course, you can inspect any roadkill and carrion that you see, but please put your safety first. Don't follow my example here of not using gloves and things like that. I would recommend, if you are going to be prodding around in carrion, that you definitely wear gloves and be road safe as well. If you don't want to get your hands messy though, light trapping is really the way to monitor for some of those species that I mentioned. Definitely a mess-free option. So we have these 7 species that are attracted to light, and in your area you'll definitely get at least 4 of these. Other trapping methods that do involve carrion baiting, you can do several things. You can bury a larger piece of carrion, you can do pitfall traps, and also hanging traps are successful because many of the species are really good flyers, and hanging traps can have that added benefit of being a little less frequently tampered with by vertebrate scavengers. So that's a good method to choose. This is the one that we tend to do for the schemes. This is one of Matt's traps. He got a lot of tampering from vertebrates. So he did design these cages that protected the traps from everything but cows. If you put pitfall traps in fields with cows or in places with cows often like to tamper. They're very inquisitive, so they did get trampled, but they were quite successful in all other areas. So what we've got here is a simple pitfall trap, but the bait is hanging, so the bait isn't in the cup, it's in a mesh that protects it, and ultimately stops your beetles that end up in the trap being totally coated in decaying organic matter, which can be a bit nasty to sort through. We've also got a roof in here to protect it from rain. But yeah, it's very much a variation on a theme. I'm sure you've all done pitfall trapping before. You don't need me to talk you through it. When I was in the lab at Edinburgh breeding these beetles, we would have a part of the season where we would go and do some field collecting to replenish the stocks and bring in some genetic diversity. And this is one of the traps that we used. This is actually designed for monitoring the chafer that's real prolific in the States, the Japanese beetle. So the colour is totally irrelevant, I think, for carrion beetles, as they're using scent. But what we would do is we would partially fill this with soil, and then we would have a matured mouse in there to attract the beetles, and then this acts as a vein trap. They come down here and then they can't get back out. I did mention maturing our bait, and that definitely helps if you want to be doing any trapping of these beetles. And by maturing it, I mean getting it nice and ripe, so it's really, really smelly. We do think this helps with increasing the appeal for the beetles and potentially making it less appealing for some of the flies. So you can do this by putting your bait, whether that's a dead mouse that you bought from the pet shop or something, or just, piece of fish, piece of chicken, in an airtight container and leaving it in a quite warm place for a few days, and that will get it nice and stinky. So for submitting records, we would absolutely love any records that you have to come via iRecord, but of course, if you already send them into your local record centre, that is brilliant too. They will reach us one way or another. I like iRecord as a verifier because I get to see what's going on, see those nice, interesting records coming in. And for record shots, it's super, super helpful for us to get an image, because sometimes there will be a really interesting record, and for our point of view, to help us with verification, an image is really useful. And I think people worry sometimes about, you've got a live beetle, you're not a macro photographer, how am I going to get a decent shot of this thing when it's running around the moth trap? Please don't worry. We get lots of blurry photos in, and they are as helpful to us as the ones that are in perfect condition. So I can tell from this one, this is Necrophorous Vespeloides, Vespeloides, this has the beautiful curved hind legs here, lovely hairy abdomen and elytra. So we can see everything we need to from that shot. Basically what we want is a nice dorsal shot that shows the antenna, the thorax, and those abdominal segments. Even when they're completely overloaded with mites, we can still work out what they are most of the time. So again, you can just see the curved hind leg here of Necrophorous Vespeloides. Because our scheme was fairly new, we only started in 2016 properly, we didn't have the historical data like some of the other schemes have had, like the longhorn beetle scheme has been running for much, much longer. So we kind of had to put in some groundwork and go and collect this data ourselves. So being a curator, I was able to do this slightly through my work with the collection that I work with. But in my spare time, I have been going around and accumulating records from other museums too. So visited Liverpool, the NHM, Cambridge, Bristol, various museums. There's still many more to be done though. This is a very laborious process. But it's really, really important to have that baseline data so that we can compare the records that we're getting in now with those of the past to look at these distributions. And so really we couldn't have produced the atlas without having this historical information too. It's been really, really valuable. It's also helped us to go back and look for particular species at certain sites. So still for Carrionata, there is one specimen of this in Liverpool Museum. We've got one in Scotland at the museum where I am, and there's a little series at Oxford because this was predominantly collected by Nash, and it hadn't been seen since the 80s. It still hasn't been seen because unfortunately we went back to the exact place where Nash last recorded it, and we put traps out, and unfortunately we haven't found it yet, but we do want to increase the effort here. It's on private woodland in Wiltshire, Great Ridge Wood, you may have heard of it. It's a fantastic site, and we're really hoping that this beetle is hanging on in there. Hopefully it is. And so just before the book came out, Steve Lane was able to do a review of the sylphids, and the book then contains all the new conservation statuses for each of the species based on this historic data and data from current recording efforts. One bit of positive news that we've had is that actually Thanatophilus dispar has been downgraded from critically endangered to vulnerable. So that was a positive. One of the few that there is, but it was really great that this pool of records that we've been able to accrue over the last few years has enabled this report to come out. So pretty pleased with that. So next steps are to keep going, really. Just keep pushing on with recording and encouraging others to record these beetles. We're hoping that by 2022 we might be able to get back to doing in-person workshops. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Definitely the most fun part of our workshops is doing the trapping, showing people how to set pitfall traps. We usually will prepare some in advance as well, so that hopefully we've caught something and we have something to show the participants. And then, as I mentioned, I'm quite keen to pursue the larvae and produce a identification resource there as well. So that really leaves me just to say a big thanks to everybody that's helped so far, everyone that's encouraged me and supported me along the way, but mostly to Matt and Richard for working with me and being my scheme buddies. And then, of course, a huge thanks to Steve Lane and Colin Lucas for letting me work with them on the Atlas, because that's been really great fun, and is certainly going to raise more awareness of these two beetle groups.